Hey, thank you everyone for joining us. We are really glad to have you here. I am Megan McConaughey, the director of the APSA Congressional Fellowship Program. And on behalf of APSA, I would like to welcome you to this webinar. We're really excited to be able to do this. I've got a couple of just notes at the top. First, we ask all webinar participants to adhere to APSA's Respect campaign. The Respect campaign encourages professional respect by and toward all APSA event attendees and participants at all times. Respect stands for respectful, equitable, safe, professional, and ethical conduct toward all. You can learn more about this campaign and the APSA anti-harassment policy and code of conduct on APSA's website. Throughout the event today, feel free to use the Q&A box to ask any questions. We'll pass those along to the presenters. We will also be recording the event and making it available on APSA's website shortly. Closed captioning has been enabled, so if you would like to view the captions, you can go ahead and click the icon at the bottom of your screen. So with all of that out of the way, I'm really glad to be able to introduce our incredible panel of scholars to go ahead and discuss the 118th Congress and what's happened so far and what to expect. So I'll start with Catherine Wineinger. She's an assistant professor of political science at Western Washington University and was a 2019-2020 APSA Congressional Fellow. Her first book, Gendering the GOP, Intra-Party Politics and Republican Women's Representation in Congress, was published in 2022 with Oxford University Press. We also have Jason Casellas with us. He's an associate professor of political science at the University of Houston. He specializes in American politics with research and teaching interests in Latino politics, legislative politics, and state and local politics. He is the author of Latino Representation in State Houses in Congress and co-author of Governing Texas, a leading textbook in Texas government. We also have Matthew Green, a professor of politics who has taught at Catholic University since 2005. His research and teaching interests include U.S. Congress, political leadership, state legislative politics, American elections, and American political development. Dr. Green's most recent book, Newt Gingrich, The Rise and Fall of a Party Entrepreneur, co-authored with Jeff Crouch, uses media accounts, original interviews, and newly uncovered archival material to explain the motivations and influence of former Congressman and Speaker Newt Gingrich. Michael Minta is a professor of political science at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. He specializes in congressional politics, interest groups, and race and ethnic politics. Dr. Minta regularly teaches courses in U.S. government pertaining to African American politics, congressional politics, and interest group advocacy. And last but not least, we have Molly Reynolds, a senior fellow in governance studies at Brookings. She studies Congress with an emphasis on how congressional rules and procedure affect domestic policy outcomes. She's the author of the book Exceptions to the Rule, The Politics of Filibuster Limitations in the U.S. Senate, which explores the creation, use, and consequences of the budget reconciliation process and other procedures that prevent filibusters in the U.S. Senate. He also supervises the maintenance of vital statistics on Congress, Brookings' long-running resource on the first grade. So we are really excited to have all of you here to give us a little bit of insight of what is going on down in Capitol Hill, what we have seen so far, and what to expect, because it's been pretty exciting. So we'll start with just getting your thoughts and then dive into questions after that. So let's start with Kathy. Can you give us sort of your key insights with what's been happening so far and what you expect to happen with the 100 days?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be on this panel. I will say I feel like I want to talk about so many different things. So I'm excited to have this super diverse panel here so we can have that, in-depth conversation. I'll just sort of start with a couple of things that interest me based off of my research on Republican women's representation and my newer work on, staff organizing in Congress. So again, two things. I'm really interested in women's representation and specifically sort of the gender dynamics in the Republican conference right now. And then also staff organizing efforts. I will say we are, I think it's important to know, in the most diverse Congress currently in terms of both gender and race. Both parties, I think, in the last few election cycles have made pretty significant efforts to diversify their candidates. We're seeing Republican women talk about their gender as an asset to the party, especially with gender issues becoming more salient across the country. We see Elise Stefanik, who is House Republican Conference Chair. She's been really at the forefront of this effort in her party, working to recruit and support women candidates in primaries across the country. And that effort, I think, among Republican women has paid off to an extent in the last couple of election cycles. And I say to an extent because we did sort of see in 2020 that, year of the Republican woman, where we saw a record number of Republican women being elected. And we have, similar numbers this time around in the 2022 election, but we didn't see the same sort of spikes that we saw in 2020 or even 2018, just among the Democratic women, right? So I think that has been a little bit surprising because we did have a record number of Republican women running for office and filing their candidacies, but it didn't, in terms sort of following the general trend, right, of Republicans not doing as well as we expected them to do. Republican women did not do as well as we expected them to do. And I think it's important to note that this partisan gap, right, between Republican women and Democratic women has remained. It's still really large. So in the House, Democratic women make up about 42% of their caucus. In the Republican conference, women make up about 15%. So still really large gaps. We have, I think, 3 Republican women who will be chairs of committees this Congress. That's down from 7 when Democrats were in control. So this gap, between Republican and Democratic women has really persisted over time. And I think in an institution where the majority party has a lot of power, it means we're going to be lacking women's perspectives in a lot of policy discussions, I think, over the next couple of years. What I will say is, I think, interesting in this Congress, as well as in the previous Congress, is the racial and ideological diversity among the Republican women. So currently there are 7 Republican women of color, which is up from 5 in the last Congress. So still not a huge number, but slowly diversifying. Also in terms of ideology, we're seeing a diversification there. So when the Freedom Caucus, which I'm sure we'll get into during this talk, right? When the Freedom Caucus was founded in 2015, there was only one woman who was part of that caucus, Cynthia Lummis. And it was really an all-male caucus from like 2017 to 2019 until Debbie Lesko joined. And today we have 7 women in the Freedom Caucus, which is about 21% of all Republican women in the House. So the ideological divisions that we're seeing among the GOP and within the party, we're seeing among the women too. So I'm really curious to see whether and how Republican women will be able to work together in any way, both on policy as well as in terms of, recruiting more Republican women candidates. Can they sort of shift their messaging efforts to try to diversify the party? My initial thought is probably not, right? Because they haven't really been able to do so to a great extent yet. And I think it's harder with such ideological diversity now in the party. But I think there is still sort of a significant divide between even the most moderate Republican women and their Democratic women colleagues. So there is still an incentive to mobilize around a partisan identity and a gender identity. So I'm curious to see if Republican women will come together in any sort of way. And then the second point, I'll just make this sort of a brief point, but I'm starting a new project on progressive politics in Congress and organizing efforts specifically right now among staff. Last Congress, we saw a pretty significant mobilization effort among progressive staff specifically. They formed the Congressional Progressive Staff Association, and a lot of those same people have been really essential to the development of a congressional workers union. And so last year, the House passed House Resolution 1096, which officially grants House staffers protections to unionize under the Congressional Accountability Act of 1995, which we can get into a little bit more. And so I think there have been, under the new House rules package, some pushback against these unionization efforts. And so I'm going to be really curious to see, again, whether and how staffers respond to that pushback, and see if we do see continued organizing efforts among staffers.
Thanks, Kathy. Before moving to our next panelist, I just want to give the entire panel a chance to add or respond to what Kathy said. We'll have plenty of time later as well, but
yes, I just want to add, so Kathy did a really great job of talking about the increasing diversification, particularly on the Democratic side of the aisle, but also in the Republican conference. And I think for folks who sort of care about representation and descriptive representation, that's a really important trend to study. What it's also come in conjunction with just really high levels of turnover, particularly in the House more generally. And so I think we'll talk more later about sort of what we're watching going forward. But one of the big things that I am paying attention to, which is sort of fiscal politics and the debt limit and that sort of thing, one big consequence of the just general amounts of turnover we've seen among on both sides of the aisle, especially on the Republican side of the aisle, is that there are relatively small parts of both the Democratic caucus. The Democratic caucus is about 30%. The Republican conference in the House is about 22%, who were in Congress when we had our last really epic showdown over the debt limit in the summer of 2011. And so as we think about the wide range of consequences of member turnover, it's also true that because of turnover and the rules that the Republicans have for committee chairs, many of the new Republican committee chairs in the House are also relatively new to the chamber. There are 8 Republican committee chairs who have less than 10 years of experience in the chamber, and half of the conference as a whole has arrived since Republicans lost the majority in 2018. So there's just a lot of I think it's helpful to think generally about the amount of change that we're seeing, and that it has a really wide set of consequences.
thank you. So next we have Jason.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for inviting me to be part of this. It's really interesting so far. And I want to sort of build on what Kathy was talking about in terms of diversity. As she said, right, this Congress is the most diverse yet. And I looked up the numbers, 133 out of the 534 members of the House and Senate are members of racial and ethnic minorities. 10 years ago, it was about 67, right? So we see this gradual increase. And it was interesting what Molly just said about sort of turnover, and I didn't realize the extent of that, because one of the projects that I'm working on that I think will have an impact here is just the growth of Latinos running, especially Latino Republicans running in state legislatures. And we know that sort of the bench, so to speak, of where members of Congress come from often are state legislators. So it'll be interesting to see that trend and how it transpires. Well, one of the things that I've been working on as well is sort of looking at Latino representation, and I wanted just to get a sense of where we stand on that, because 20 years ago was a very sort of small percentage of the Congress. If you look at the last election from 2020 to 2022, the number of Latinos in Congress went from 38 to 45. In terms of the partisan breakdown, from 28 Democrats to 34 Democrats, and 10 Republicans to 11 Republicans. So now Congress, for the first time, about over 10% of Congress is Latino, and this is for the first time. The population, of course, is higher, about 17 or 18%, but we know that, of course, there is this, when we talk about descriptive representation, this sort of lag for Latinos especially. And so when we look at sort of how we see the internal workings of Congress in terms of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, Congressional Black Caucus. I know Michael will probably say more about the CBC, but if we look at sort of the leadership, especially on the Democratic side, I think it's also important to note, that Hakeem Jeffries, of course, being the first African-American leader, and of course, if Democrats were in the majority, would be the first Black speaker. And of course, Pete Aguilar as well, the number 2, who's also Latino. And I don't think we've seen a situation thus far where you have members of racial or ethnic minorities in such high positions within the Democratic caucus. Of course, on the Republican caucus, it's a different story. As we'll talk, I'm sure, about the speaker vote and Kevin McCarthy's trouble getting to become speaker, which I'm sure others will have a lot more to say about that. But before I kind of talk about that, I want to just say a little bit about the elections, about the midterm elections, and in particular, sort of the expectations that many had, sort of many pundits had, that there would be this red wave. And indeed, early in the night, if you looked at the numbers coming from Florida, which was one of the first states to report, it seemed that there would be a red wave. And I was in New York that evening for one of the networks. And one of the things we noticed, right, was that Florida was sort of indicating that possibly there would be this red wave. Of course, as the numbers came in from Virginia and other parts of the country, we quickly realized that that wasn't the case. And I think it's something we can talk about later, sort of how, the expectations about what happens in midterm elections traditionally has kind of shifted here, especially given sort of the role that we thought that, high inflation in particular, and the president's relatively low job approval numbers, that this would kind of automatically lead to Republican gains, or significant Republican gains, that is. We didn't see that. And I think it would be interesting to kind of look at sort of, in the past, we used to talk about retrospective voting, right? Especially when it comes to presidential elections. But, have we seen sort of the state of the economy, or the economy not becoming as predictive as it used to be? And of course, that, has a lot of sort of reasons for that. Of course, we can look at this past election and see how other issues may have motivated Democrats to vote at higher rates than normal, like the Dobbs decision, of course, especially Democratic women. Of course, we do see that this new House majority is similar to the Democratic majority in terms of the margin. And I'm sure others will have a lot to say about McCarthy. But I think one of the things that was interesting to me is to see sort of how Pelosi was able, of course, to be one of the most powerful speakers probably since Gingrich, I guess. And, she was able to keep her caucus together. And of course, McCarthy, had a lot of difficulty. And so thinking about sort of how will this affect McCarthy's leadership in the future? And sort of, will he be a quote unquote weak speaker, or will he sort of regain strength, as he proceeds? And I think this is something that will be interesting to watch. And briefly on the Senate side, I think the story there was about candidate quality, right? We saw candidates like Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania and Herschel Walker in Georgia, really giving trouble to Republican hopes of gaining a couple seats there. But I still think you're going to see a high influence of Senator Manchin and Sinema, of course, given the narrow margin in the Senate. And so this contrast with Pelosi, I think, on the House side is really interesting, and especially how Pelosi was able to, keep the squad, so to speak, within her control. And of course, McCarthy having more difficulty with the Freedom Caucus has been mentioned earlier. And so as we move forward in this coming sort of year, I think, and Molly, I've already alluded to the first sort of issue that we're going to deal with is the debt ceiling, and sort of the extent to which that will linger, and how the markets have responded so far, which, today the markets are a little bit lower, depending on whether Congress can have this sort of come to an agreement with the Biden administration on the debt ceiling. And then finally, I just wanted to say about immigration continued to be an issue that Republicans will push in the House. We haven't had major immigration reform in a very long time. Probably 1986 is the last really major piece of immigration reform. And there is a sort of a concern, right, about this immigration is an issue. And hopefully Congress can, come to terms with the president. I'm not as optimistic as I used to be when it comes to some of these issues, but I think these are issues that we'll certainly see Congress, especially the House, deal with. And finally, of course, oversight is going to be a big story of this coming Congress, as we've already seen with the issue with classified documents, and sort of how different individuals will be sort of investigated depending on, on the nature of those things. But I'll just stop there, and I look forward to having a conversation with the rest of you. Thank you.
Thank you. I expect that you touched on several things that Matt is going to bring up when he speaks next, but does anyone have anything in particular they want to respond to or add? We'll move on to Matt's immediate reflections.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be on this panel, and I'm looking forward to our further conversation and to questions from the audience. In the interest of time, I won't go into too much detail, but I thought what I'd do is just first say in general how I think about this question of what a new Congress will do and the kind of categories of variables that I think about. And some of them have already been touched upon by Kathy and Jason, and then say a little bit about, time permitting, about the speaker battle and about its consequences, potential consequences for the way the House works. So when I think about a new Congress, I think about trying to kind of predict or expect what's going to happen. One category of variables that I look at or I talk to my students about are what you could call parties and personnel. So things like, do we have unified or divided government? Are there large majorities or small majorities? What kind of divisions are there within the parties? Who are the leaders? So that's kind of one basket. The second is the agenda. And part of that is what a party might have said they're going to talk about. So for example, the Republicans have this, House Republicans have this commitment to America. But then there's sort of unofficial things. So like Jason mentioned, oversight and investigations, things of that sort. And then also related to that is kind of what's the message of the election. David Mayhew once wrote, members of Congress, if nothing else, think that an election conveys a message. So, as you heard earlier with this narrow election, there's a potential narrative here that, maybe Dobbs was a bad idea, or that Trump is maybe not so helpful to the party after all, from the Republicans' perspective. Of course, Democrats think Trump is very helpful to their party. True or not, these narratives take hold and they can determine how members of Congress act in the next Congress. And then the last basket of things are upcoming events and deadlines. So, Jason talked about the debt ceiling, for example, but there's other things too, like the ag bill, which is coming down the pipe. There's these things that members have to deal with, not to mention the regular appropriations process. So with that in mind, what I want to dive into a little bit is the speaker battle. And I think push back a little bit on some of the media narrative that's been surrounding that battle and its consequences. So certainly, first of all, it was for those of us who follow these things and study congressional history, I found it wildly entertaining. I was at some friend's house on a Friday night. We were sitting around drinking beer, and someone said, "Let's turn on C-SPAN." Only in Washington, D.C. would that be the thing you do at 11 o'clock at night. And it was, it was quite fun for us nerds to, Congress nerds to watch that. So there's a lot of drama, there's a lot of conflict, and of course there's a lot of narrative about how this makes Kevin McCarthy a weaker speaker. Part of that is the fact that this battle took place in public eye. One thing that people often don't realize is that this is not unusual in the last 10 years or so to have dissenting votes on the House floor for speaker, and there's a variety of reasons for that. But in some ways, I think the narrative has been a little unfair to McCarthy because it broke out in the open, which of course is a sign that he was unable to prevent this from happening. But these still take place behind closed doors. There was a piece in the New Yorker where someone wrote and said, well, if this is how McCarthy's going to have to govern, like he did with the speaker battle, where he has to make these deals and there's going to be this dissent, then he's going to have a very difficult speakership and it might even be cut short. And my first thought was Nancy Pelosi in 2018, her run for speaker. She did not have the votes. She had to make deals. The only difference is that she made those deals behind closed doors, and she was successful at doing it before the vote happened. But people aren't calling Pelosi's speakership a failure, right? As Jason said, one of the most powerful speakers, at least since Newt Gingrich. So it's not as if this process inherently leads to a weaker speakership. I think where the crux of the matter is what did McCarthy give in exchange for these votes? So Pelosi, for example, gave someone a subcommittee assignment or promised a bill would be considered by the rules committees, are relatively minor, deals or minor things she was giving up. McCarthy was giving some more substantial things to dissenters. So, for example, committee assignments, promises to bring bills to the floor, reducing the threshold for a vacate. It's not technically a motion to vacate, as I've been corrected on Twitter, but a privilege resolution to declare the speakership vacant. You only need one member to bring that up. But here again, I think the conventional wisdom, I sort of push back on what some people think is really significant here. And in particular, the media has played up to a great extent that motion to vacate, as I'm calling it. It's not a motion to vacate. That only one member is necessary to bring it to the floor. And so there's this proverbial gun pointed to McCarthy's head. If he doesn't do what the Freedom Caucus wants, one of them will kick him out as speaker. As several folks, Josh Huter and others have pointed out, as a practical matter, this is not likely to happen really. It's very unlikely to actually be a real threat to McCarthy for a number of reasons. One of them is it still has to pass on the floor. It also assumes that Democrats would vote for it, which they might, but they might not. And in fact, when Speaker Boehner resigned, Democrats were talking about refusing to vote on this privilege resolution at all, which would have meant that Boehner would have won and stayed speaker. So I don't think it's nearly as big a concession as some folks have made it out to be. However, where there is some really potentially significant concession is with committee assignments, and in particular, the Rules Committee. The fact that you have 3 dissenters or say difficult Republicans appointed to the Rules Committee, including Tom Massey, which I never in a million years thought would ever get a position on the Rules Committee, is potentially very significant because the Rules Committee effectively controls the agenda of the House floor. Now, some have said this means that these 3 Republicans are going to force the other Republicans on the Rules Committee to move to the right and to allow only conservative amendments to bills, et cetera. That's quite possible. I'm intrigued by the possibility that they might join with Democrats to have more open rules so that both Freedom Caucus members and Democrats get to amend legislation. So then in that case, we'd be going back to the mid-20th century with this kind of cross-party coalitions that are undermining what the majority of the majority party wants. So I don't know if that's going to happen, but that could have real significant effects for the way the House operates, and it could open things up significantly. So, I guess I'd summarize by saying that, this was a big battle. McCarthy certainly gave up some significant things, but it might be the things that the press is not paying that much attention to. And the last thing I'll just say very quickly, and then turn over to the rest of the panel. It occurred to me thinking about the leaders that we have now in the House and Senate. The old narrative or the old kind of dividing line was sort of party. Republicans have, and this is definitely true in the House and to some extent in the Senate, they have more seasoned leaders. They were older. Democrats have younger leaders who are less experienced. It seems now the dividing line is by chamber. So we have Schumer and McConnell who have been in leadership for some time, particularly McConnell. They know how this game is played. Where in the House, we've got 2 new top party leaders, Jeffries and McCarthy. And so I think that could have an interesting impact on the way the House operates versus the Senate. But with that, I'll conclude and thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts.
Thank you, Matt. Are there any immediate responses or anything to add? Well, in that case, I will turn it over to Michael.
Hello. Hey, Megan. Everyone, thanks for inviting me. When you start going toward the end, it's like, what new can I add, really? But I think I want to just bring up a few points. So one, yeah, I watched C-SPAN, and wow, that was just amazing, that vote for the House Speaker for the Republicans. I don't think we've ever seen anything like that. And just the reactions of members on the chamber was just great. Yeah, must see TV. Anyway, but the one thing we talked a lot about diversity in Congress, and and how it's one of the most diverse Congress in terms of racially and ethnically, and also in terms of gender. But what's also been mentioned is this idea with this rising diversity, and particularly in the House of Representatives, you're also seeing the rise in party polarization at the same time. And so, I mean, that raises some very interesting challenges, you know, as civil rights activists and everyone kind of celebrate these ideas of the Voting Rights Act and increasing diversity in Congress. Things that Congress usually agrees on, like raising the debt ceiling, having fights over that, you know, are really making it difficult to just get the regular order of business done in Congress. So that's somewhat troubling for, you know, finally you're seeing diversity, but you're also starting to see way more conflict on things that must pass. And so, so that's, even though we can celebrate the diversity in Congress, there's also a concern about what can Congress get done? Are we going to still have this infighting? And as we have said, even though Republicans are diversifying somewhat, but it's still not to the same extent as a Democratic caucus and in terms of racial and ethnic diversity. And so, you know, these are concerning things. Now, the Senate still has a ways to go, but still what's going on in the House, the Senate's not immune from the partisan debates that are going on. I mean, the Democrats and Republicans are organized, and they're paying attention to what's happening also in the House. What does this mean for passing of legislation or getting bills done? That many of these underrepresented groups, they're starting to see people that look like them. You know, they're seeing Hakeem Jeffries giving the ABC speech before McCarthy, which was very interesting and good. What does that mean? Are you going to see more action on issues that minorities and underrepresented groups care about? Are you going to see action on civil rights, voting rights? Are we going to see issue in terms of to improve the economic conditions of underserved communities? I mean, that's the thing that many voters are concerned about. Like, if you're going to have all this racial and ethnic diversity, is it going to bring about meaningful legislation and change and funding? Another issue that I'm concerned about are the institutions themselves and these efforts by conservatives to discredit the institutions. We see it with the January 6th, where votes of over the Electoral College not ratifying the presidential election. But it's not just the presidency. You're also seeing these efforts about elections in general, and are our representatives, are they legitimate and true representatives of the populace? And so that type of rhetoric can be very damaging to our political institutions, particularly the Congress, as they become more racially and ethnically and gender diverse. Before, I mean, not saying that Congress has always had a great approval rating, but still, people respected our political institutions and the decisions and the laws that come from there. So I'm concerned that, you know, all of this misinformation, these efforts not to look at our leaders as being duly elected, I mean, it's very concerning in what Congress can do in order to pass legislation that's meaningful. So I think things that we have to consider is the type of candidates that you know, our electoral system. Are there any particular reforms that could possibly change the type of representatives that we're sending to Congress? And this unwillingness to compromise. People have said things like ranked choice voting might bring more moderate people to the table. These independent redistricting commissions as an opportunity to take some of the partisanship and get candidates that are responsive to both parties. I mean, these are the different types of forms that I think that political scientists really need to grapple with more. I mean, it's out there, but to make it more of a central part of the research agenda to see is there something that we can do research-wise to provide answers to public policymakers to make our legislative institutions more functional? So those are my thoughts for now.
Thank you. Any initial responses to that? In that case, we will turn things over to Molly.
Thanks, Megan, and thanks for asking me to be here. Like Michael said, when you go last, the easiest thing to do is just say everyone else said really smart things. I agree with all of them. In this case, that's true. Just a couple of things to add. One, a sort of very high level observation coming out of the 2022 midterms, which is just the consequences for both the House and the Senate of the extremely narrow majorities that the Republicans hold in the House and the Democrats hold in the Senate. That has big consequences for both policymaking overall, but even for kind of how the parties themselves are going to try and use their majorities to get things done, even if it's just on what we might call a messaging basis. So Jason before mentioned sort of immigration and Republicans on immigration. I think a really good example of like the consequences going forward of the very small Republican majority in the House is that there were originally plans to bring to the floor in the House this week a sort of, again, likely to be a messaging bill around kind of what the DHS secretary can do to shut off access at the border for folks trying to enter the United States. That has been postponed because there are Republican divisions on that question about like what kind of immigration bill do they want to see on the floor. And so I think that even as we think about there are sort of big must-do things like the debt limit, like funding the government, but beyond that, just the really slim majority that Republicans have in the chamber. And I'll just note, since this is like a pet interest of mine, that Republicans also eliminated proxy voting. So one thing that had been available to Democrats when they were in the majority since the middle of 2020 as kind of a COVID adaptation was the ability of members to designate another House member to vote by proxy for them. We can debate sort of the ways in which that kind of evolved beyond its original intended purpose as a COVID protection, but it certainly meant that on close votes, Pelosi as speaker needed to be less worried about the occasional absence for all kinds of reasons of her members. Republicans now, folks may or may not be aware of the fact that one Republican member, Greg Steube of Florida, was injured in a home accident this past week. And so, you know, can't travel to Washington for a while. And so that is just, again, an example of the, and without proxy voting, the example of the kinds of consequences. And I think in the Senate, you know, we sort of have talked less about the Senate so far, but even there, the Democrats' 51 vote majority is consequential. It's unlike the last 2 years where there's been a tie, again, asserting that Kyrsten Sinema is still associating with the Democratic Party for the purposes of organizing the chamber. It will make some things easier for Democrats. But, you know, when we think about things like the debt limit, it's not just like where are House Republicans on the debt limit, it's also where's Joe Manchin on the debt limit, and where are where's the center of that chamber on the debt limit. So we're living in this era of really narrow majorities, and I think that one thing we should take out of the 2022 midterms is just a reminder that those are really consequential. The other thing I would say, I made one of the points I was going to make when we were discussing turnover earlier, but just to build on Matt's point about sort of the specific concessions that McCarthy made to blocs within the Republican conference as he attempted to get elected speaker. I think it's really useful to think about those concessions, both in terms of their policy consequences, but then also in terms of their process consequences. And I tend to think that on a number of fronts, the policy fights were going to be the same, whether McCarthy had made those concessions to the Freedom Caucus wing of the conference or not. You know, we were going to have trouble raising the debt limit, whether he put three Freedom Caucus bloc folks on the Rules Committee or not. I tend to think that like the rules committee was never going to be the principal obstacle to getting a debt limit deal to the floor. But one thing I will be really curious to watch is whether those folks, those three members do demand certain process changes, which may well actually make the lives of their more pragmatic, more electorally vulnerable Republican colleagues more difficult. So for example, if we do see a return to more floor debate in the House under more open processes, so more amendment opportunities, we know from the last several times that the House tried to open up debate on things on the floor, that was a recipe for amendments that sort of electorally vulnerable members of the majority party did not want to take. And so I think there is a place where like I think on the process side, we could see probably more consequences of some of these specific concessions than on the policy side.
Great, thank you, everyone. That was very helpful and enlightening already. I do have a couple of questions in the question and answer, and I'd like to remind all of the attendees that we welcome additional questions through the Q&A part of the webinar. The first one I'll ask is one that immediately goes to what Molly was just talking about, and that is, in addition to its implications for the more electorally vulnerable members of the Republican Party, don't more open rules tend to benefit the minority party? So is there sort of an interesting tension in the House Freedom Caucus demands for more open rules in terms of how it affects the minority party as well? And feel free to just jump in as you've got.
Yeah, so Matt as a inveterate chronicler of the House Freedom Caucus may have some thoughts on this, but I'll just say that I think this is a place where, at least for the past the later periods of the last Republican House majority, where folks in the Freedom Caucus, sort of on that wing of the conference, have actually felt like they were also not being treated fairly by the Rules Committee in their request for their own consideration of their amendments. And so I think that's one of the places where, like, one of the reasons you're seeing this crop up as a demand from them is because they felt like they were also being marginalized. And then the other thing I'll say is that as we go forward, exactly what it means to have a quote unquote more open process could turn up in a variety of ways. It could be that, as I think this week, the House is scheduled to have debate on a bill involving oil drilling that is to come to the floor under a basically open rule, an open rule with a pre-printing requirement. So folks have to file their amendments in advance. You could imagine that if there are too many hijinks that start to come from the minority party in the amendment context, that Republicans say, okay, we're going to dramatically restrict the rights of the minority party while still having relatively open amendment opportunities for our side of the aisle. So like, there's not, as anyone who studies the House knows, this is not sort of an on-off switch. There are all kinds of gradients that we might see.
I'll just add to that, because to Molly's excellent points, that the question says, will this open rules benefit the minority party? But the question is, how do you define benefit? So traditionally, or sort of the thing that's happened in the House over the years is that you have two things that have discouraged open rules, which is, number one, as Molly said, the hijinks. So offering an amendment to cut a bill by $500,000 and then amending that to make it $750,000, you're just slowing things down, right? So dilatory stuff. And this has led to a clamping down on open opportunities for the minority, which makes sense because the House has to function. A second, though, is about politics, which is members just don't want to have to cast votes they think will hurt them. As Molly said, they're in swing districts. That's understandable, but a number of us who believe the House should be more open have sort of said, well, come on. I mean, you're elected, right, to serve, and that means sometimes you have to take hard votes. And so if members have courage to say, yeah, I'm willing to vote this way, even though it might hurt my reelection, then that diminishes, that power you're giving the minority diminishes. But the third is with actual policy, which is these amendments pass. And I think that there is this tension among those who want an open house who are members, between this inherent desire for just opportunity, as Molly said. I just want to have an amendment, just let me do something, but also wanting policy victories. So if you look at the Freedom Caucus, and when they've come up with lists of what we want the House to do or how we want it to change, you see some of the just let it be open, even if we lose, but we see some things where they say, we really want to have power over what passes. So I think that's what's going to really come to the fore in this Congress. Will be really interesting. And I will note that the Rules Committee, these 3 members who were added, it's an interesting group. They're not all in the Freedom Caucus. Like Thomas Massie is not a member of the Freedom Caucus. He and Chip Roy, who are in the Freedom Caucus, are some of the biggest advocates for an open process. And Tom Massie, I mean, he just doesn't like to follow parties. So that's where it gets really interesting, where some of these folks who are on the Rules Committee might want to open things up so their side can win, but they might want to open things up just for the sake of opening them up.
Anyone else want to add to that? Okay. We've got another question here about something that has been in the news a lot recently. Do we expect George Santos to be removed from his office or to face any consequences? And is there, why would we expect that to be the case?
So I can weigh in a little bit. I would be really interested to less about sort of the sort of Santos, is he going to be removed from office? But I think I'd be really interested to sort of hear from maybe Kathy and or Jason about, again, like this, you know, we see this increasing diversity in the Republican conference, and then you know, just sort of how Santos fits in with that. But I will say that just as a matter of like, will it come to a point where there is a vote on the floor of the House to remove George Santos from office? I'm very skeptical of that possibility. I mean, I think, as we have seen in other situations, like it could reach a point where there are enough members of the Republican leadership who think Santos and what the circumstances of his campaign for Congress are politically damaging to the Republican conference, to the point that it is not in their interest to continue to have him in the conference. And then I think it would be sort of pressure for him to resign. I think that would be the mechanism. But to go back to what I was saying before about the size of the Republican conference, the Republican majority, you know, it is the majority is thin. Santos is from a district that has historically sent Democrats to Congress. It would not necessarily be in Kevin McCarthy's interest to put that seat up for a special election. Again, depending on sort of the politics. And so I'm sort of skeptical that that would be in their short-term interest, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I would just agree with everything Molly said. You know, I would add, you know, the county Republican Party in Nassau County there in Long Island voted to say he should resign. Of course, he's not going to do that. I think the way McCarthy is sort of viewing this is that, and what he's telling reporters is basically, you know, you can't sort of remove someone for lying. If that's the case, and, you know, most of Congress could be removed. But what he's saying is that the ethics committee will have to have an investigation whether he violated any sort of campaign finance laws. And that seems to be the area in where the ethics committee is moving to see if there's any violation of laws, at which point it will become difficult, I think, for Republicans to sort of, you know, keep him in the conference, right? If he's sort of been found guilty of violating campaign laws. And at that point, the situation might change. But I guess the hope is that things will just sort of, we'll move on to another scandal or another topic, and that Santos will just be the sort of black sheep in the Republican conference. Who knows, though, you know, as we've seen, there's always a new sort of revelation. I don't know how much more scandalous we can possibly see here. We've seen it all. We never thought that a member of the conference would have to sort of deny reports that he dressed in drag. That's not something that we would have expected. But yeah, so that's where I would sort of say in terms of diversity, right? I mean, because he sort of claimed to be Jewish, and I'm trying to keep track of all the all the lies here, but and that he wasn't actually Jewish, is from Brazil. And so, yeah, I mean, it's sort of one of those sort of areas in which Santos is clearly a burden, I think, for the Republicans. Whether it'll affect sort of Republicans in other districts, I don't see that. I think by the time the next election comes around, we won't. I mean, he certainly won't get reelected if he does try to run for reelection.
Well, Jason, I actually think that it could affect other races, particularly in New York, where New York, the Democrats were fairly abysmal in terms of, and even the head of the DCCC losing, Maloney losing his own seat. So I think Democrats will use Santos and to really highlight, like, can we trust this party? I mean, there's just so many lies of Santos, and the fact that many Republicans, like they said, it was an open secret. But what's even more troubling for Democrats, they didn't know really, or didn't pursue, right? Like opposition research, like they need a refund, right? Of how does a candidate like this get through? And all the memes on Twitter are just hilarious. But I do think that they will use him the same way that Republicans use Ilhan Omar here in Minnesota. Even though she's in a relatively safe district, you can go to any outstate district and there's a picture of Ilhan Omar. And so I imagine Democrats will do the same thing to Santos in New York, and maybe even further in other places. But the longer he stays in office, I think it's going to be a drag on Republican efforts to hold on to their majority. But I think that I think he doesn't want to resign. But and for a variety, as been mentioned on this panel, I mean, he's a vital part of it's a slim majority, and they need his votes. But I think that the way that this story is going to end, that he's leaving, and the question is, can Democrats use it to regain not just his seat, but others?
So turning a little bit away from politics and toward policy, what do we expect in terms of legislation from this Congress? The question that I have here says, what is going to pass besides appropriations? And I think there's a real question mark about appropriations as well. But what do we expect might happen in terms of actual legislating?
My hopes are not high. So I think you're right, Megan, to sort of say, there are real questions about what kind of appropriating can and will get done. There is obviously the question of the debt limit and what could be associated with a measure of raising the debt limit. Matt did mention before the coming expiration of the Farm Bill. I think that's an important thing to keep an eye on. And obviously, as we know, the Farm Bill isn't just about farm price supports. It also reauthorizes important nutrition assistance programs. So certainly consequential. But beyond that, I don't have a lot of hopes for real legislative progress in this Congress, and again, as Megan was alluded to, real concerns about even the ability to execute a healthy appropriations process. One of the not to make everything about the race, McCarthy's race for speaker, but one of the issues that was raised by some of the holdouts to McCarthy was a desire to return to appropriations bills at the fiscal year 2022 level. So that would not just be continuing them where they are, but that would be a cut from the omnibus spending bill that was passed at the end of last year back to FY22 levels, which would be be really consequential for not just the appropriations process, but also obviously for the millions of Americans who need the things that discretionary appropriations provide. And so I think that again, I have some real concerns about sort of what that process will look like.
I think there'll be a lot of messaging bills. I mean, this is just not just because it's Congress, but because it's divided government. So House Republicans are going to do there's going to be a lot of action to the extent they can keep their very narrow majority on things on their, commitment to America. Democrats in the Senate will try to do the same. But I'm going to channel, Francis Lee and Jim Curry here. There's a lot of legislating that happens with bipartisan support or cross-party support. And it may be on things we don't even know yet because of changing circumstances. If I had to say things where there could be bipartisan support and you see some legislative action, could be on things like insulin, support, vets, healthcare. You could see potentially a police funding bill, depending on how it's structured, could make it to the House and Senate. There might even be some things like climate change where there's the potential. In the House, it would be hard with Republican leadership probably not wanting that on the agenda. But, I'm just trying to think creatively here. I think there's the potential for some legislative action, but obviously it's not going to be the same model of the previous 2 years when you have unified government, and a newly elected president with a pretty rigorous legislative agenda.
Well, I'm watching for, immigration. You keep seeing the president, for the Vice President Kamala Harris, she went down to the border. President, Freedom Caucus, obviously they want things done. I don't see anything happening, but it seems like there is some willingness by both parties, but it seems to happen almost every session, right? That there's going to be something done on immigration. But I could see something that's a very small package on immigration where Republicans and conservatives might get more at the border. I think they got some concessions a few sessions ago. I think you might see more of that. The question is, would Democrats, like, what would they get? What would they be willing to tolerate? But I could see the president, and I can see some Democrats pushing for more sort of like enforcement at the border and supporting of immigration control there. So something small, not major.
Yeah, I agree with what sort of everyone said about the specific policies that, there are probably some policies that can get bipartisan support, but I'm curious about the messaging bills, right? I like studying messaging in Congress, how messaging forms. So I'm sure we'll see a lot of messaging bills being passed by House Republicans, but I'm also curious about what the bills will look like and what the messaging strategies will look like coming from Democrats who are now in the minority, and in particular, the role that like the Progressive Caucus will play in shaping the Democrats' messaging strategy, both in terms of policy and also sort of heading into 2024. So I think progressives have a little bit more messaging power in the House now than they did in the previous Congress. So.
And just one thing to add, because as a person who spends a lot of time thinking about the Senate, I don't want to not talk about the Senate at all. And just to say that this isn't a legislation question, but I do expect that the Senate will spend quite a lot of the next 2 years processing nominations, both because it is a thing that they can do on a simple majority basis. We know that sort of the stakes of the makeup of the federal judiciary are higher than they've ever been. We know that Republicans in the Senate care quite a lot about the direction of the federal judiciary. And so I think Democrats will spend a lot of time trying to process judicial and other executive branch nominees. And again, because they now have a clear organizing majority, that stands to be at least marginally easier for them than it was in the past 2 years, because in situations where committees are tied, they no longer have to sort of jump through the procedural hoops to extricate nominees on which there was a tie vote out of committee.
So the next question makes a really interesting comparison between the appointment of extremist conservative Republicans to the Rules Committee, and the role that the Dixiecrats played in gatekeeping in the 1950s and 60s. Is there a sense in which it makes sense to characterize the Freedom Caucus as sort of the new Dixiecrats, or has anyone here thought about that comparison or thinks it's apt?
So it's an interesting comparison, and as I mentioned earlier, I think there's the real potential for these three Republicans who've been appointed, Chip Roy, Ralph Norman, and John Massey, to potentially vote with Democrats on the House floor. I mean, in the Rules Committee. And in that respect, they would be like these conservative Democrats in the Rules Committee in the mid-20th century, who were voting with Republicans to either block bills or to have sometimes even bring bills to the floor that wouldn't otherwise come, or to structure the rules. There's some important differences there. I mean, one is obviously ideological. So the Dixiecrats were right sort of in the median, so they could plausibly vote to the left or to the right, whereas the Freedom Caucus is pretty, and again, these three members are not all in the Freedom Caucus, so I want to be careful about generalizing, but if we consider them as a block, they might think that Democrats are way too far to the left and would rather try to, would stick with their party and try to pull their party in their direction. So it would be more like the Freedom Caucus in particularly their first 2 years, when they were voting against rules on the floor because they felt that the underlying bills, like an immigration bill, was too moderate. But on paper, they looked like they were, because they were voting with Democrats to reject rules. So they looked like they were moderate Republicans, but they weren't. So they're sort of opposite ends kind of coming to the same outcome, but for very different reasons. So that means that they aren't necessarily the most reliable bloc to vote with Democrats on things. And then also, for much of that time in the mid-20th century, the Rules Committee was chaired by a conservative Democrat who was also a Dixiecrat. It's going to elude me in a second. The chairman under Rayburn, it'll come to me in a minute. But he was a conservative Democrat who would vote, who would help build this bipartisan, this cross-party coalition. And he also, but as a result, because he was the chair, he could also do things like not have the Rules Committee meet at all. In fact, it was either I think it was Rayburn, or it may have been, I think it was Rayburn who said, at one point the Rules Committee didn't meet because the chairman he was from Virginia. Can someone on the panel help me? This is really embarrassing. Does anyone remember the name of this chairman? I keep saying Judge in my head, but I cannot remember his name, drawing a total blank. Whoever looks it up, shout it out, please. I can't remember. But he was from Virginia. And at one point he said, I can't have the Rules Committee meet to consider a bill because there's a fire. My barn burned down. So I just can't have the Rules Committee meet. To which the speaker said, I knew that he would try to block legislation. I never thought he would actually commit arson to do it.
Howard Smith.
Thank you. Howard Smith. Yes. Thank you, Molly. So we don't have a Howard Smith chairing the Rules Committee. So this bloc doesn't have the same influence that they did before. And again, as I said before, they are torn between policy preferences and an inherent desire for a more open process. They could vote with Democrats if they agree on a more open process. But if that process they think would yield more liberal outcomes, they probably won't. So I don't think the analogy is quite the same, but we could see some similar patterns in voting on the Rules Committee.
Well, one thing I want to add, it's a very interesting question. And for what Matt laid out, there are some real differences. But what it's very interesting. You have the squad over in the Democratic Party, and then you got the Freedom Caucus members, and then you have even there's diversity within the Freedom Caucus, right? You got the Lauren Boeberts and the Matt Gaetz, who are just never McCarthy until and then you had that opposition from with Pelosi with the squad, in terms of there was some real uneasiness about whether she should be House Speaker. So it is interesting to see how much of the team will the caucus members, how long will they play ball with everyone else? I mean, they've gotten some concessions, but when will we see, because we talk about this intense party polarization they're kind of openly fighting over who's going to be the speaker. But once the game starts, will they act more like a team player? The squad, despite all their differences with the Democratic leadership, they play team ball. Now they took votes that annoyed the speaker. But again, some of their votes wasn't necessarily essential. And remember, Democrats had a similar majority that the Republicans have now, and they were able to govern and get things done. So it'll just be very interesting to see how well these Freedom Caucus members play ball. Will they get the concessions and legislation that they want? We keep saying messaging bills, symbolic bills. Will that be enough for these members? Or do they need something more substantive in terms of policy in order for them to continue to be part of the team? So I think that's the key distinction to watch with McCarthy, and how he navigates his coalition in the same way that Pelosi navigated her coalition.
So Kathy is our resident expert on the progressive wing of the House Democratic Caucus. So I would love to hear her thoughts on this. But I do think it's worth also noting that one of the key differences here between the two parties is that under Pelosi's leadership, both the sort of more moderate wing of the caucus and the more progressive wing were willing to flex their political muscle when they thought it was important, and when they thought sometimes they were wrong, it would work. Whereas what we've seen, again, the 118th Congress is 3 weeks old at this point. What we've seen in the 118th so far is a lot of sort of muscle flexing from the Freedom Caucus aligned end of the conference. I think Matt is helpfully asking us to not just call them the Freedom Caucus, because they're not all Freedom Caucus members, but that end of the conference, and much less willingness to sort of flex political muscle from the more pragmatist wing of the House Republican Conference. And it may well be that those folks are sort of holding their fire for avoiding a default on the debt later this year. I don't know. But there isn't, this is just as we think about how all this will matter going forward, that's actually in some ways the part of this puzzle that I'm watching most closely, is where are those members willing to stand up and say, no, you've crossed a line. We're not gonna let the more radical wing of our conference do these things. It wasn't on the speakership vote. And so we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, I will just add, I mean, I do think that it's difficult sometimes to compare Freedom Caucus folks to the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party, right? The squad members, I think, just because I think the ideology is a bit different, right? I think there's definitely policy disagreements in terms of, on the Democratic side of the aisle, more progressive policies, but there are still policy goals, right, that progressives want to accomplish. And so there is more incentive, I think, to to work with party leadership to accomplish policy goals. Again, a lot of these folks are people of color, right? And so they are representing, more sort of disadvantaged communities, and that would benefit from policies getting passed. And so I think the incentives are a little bit different. And in the Freedom Caucus, I guess some members of the Freedom Caucus are, stalling government action is a goal, right? And so I think the goals are a little bit different, but also, I mean, I'm actually a little bit curious about this sort of newer relationship, right? Because even within the Freedom Caucus, Marjorie Taylor Greene was supposed to be this really super radical person, and is, I think, but voted for McCarthy, right? And so there is now this divide between the Matt Gaetz, the Lauren Boebert, and people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who McCarthy is essentially now aligned with and has said he is excited to sort of work with. And so I'm curious how the divisions within the Freedom Caucus aligned people, like how those divisions might, shape the party and the way that leadership deals with the caucus.
So we just have a couple of minutes left. So I'm going to go ahead and sort of smash together two questions here, having to do with inter-branch relations. And essentially, Congress has not been particularly assertive in its relations with the executive branch. One thing that's come up in recent years is widespread defiance of subpoenas from congressional committees. Do we think that there's any chance that Congress is going to assert itself against the executive branch in this coming Congress? Are there ways in which we expect that to happen? Do we expect sort of this defiance against congressional committees to continue or to matter as we look forward?
No, you want to go, Molly?
No, go ahead, Matt.
I don't see any change from past patterns where when you have divided government, one or both chambers are the opposite party of the president, so they push the president really hard, but often on things that make their base happy, as opposed to things that actually limit the power of the executive. And there's not much they can do to limit the power of the executive if it requires statute, because the president will veto it. So I, for one, would like to see Congress being more assertive. What kind of depresses me is that the extent to which we have seen Congress is being more assertive when you have, especially a Democratic president or a Republican House or Senate, is they use the power of the purse to do things like shut down the government or just refuse to raise the debt ceiling. And these are just, I find, very self-destructive uses of congressional power. But I don't see what I think we would need to see to have actual, durable shift in the power of Congress vis-a-vis the White House.
Yeah, I think the place for this, or the one thing to sort of watch pretty specifically, is exactly what kinds of tactics do Republican controlled committees in the House try to use. So one thing that we know from the sort of 18 months of the January 6th investigation is that select committee in the House really tried to, as much as it could, use expansive powers of Congress to try to get information, including around really voluminous subpoenas for things like people's phone records. And I think that there's a real question about, whether the House Republicans will try to use those same tactics. We know they are also in the process of standing up a select subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee on quote unquote the weaponization of the federal government. The irony of sort of using voluminous subpoenas to investigate the weaponization of federal government, notwithstanding. I think that's, again, a place where I'll be keeping a pretty close eye on exactly what do they use, how do they try and conduct the oversight. And again, this is all just a sort of more generally thinking about the ways in which Congress has come to rely on the courts as their sort of muscle for trying to get information, especially out of the executive branch.
Yeah, and I just want to say a little bit more. I mean, this Jordan committee, I think, as Molly says, will be really interesting. Jim Jordan is chairing it. And especially as we see sort of, this discussion, I'd be interested to see this sort of push for impeachment of cabinet officers. There's this push to impeach the Homeland Security Secretary, Mayorkas. This is something in the past, you haven't seen a lot of this push for impeachment of secretaries of Homeland Security or any other office. So that'll be interesting to watch. I think, as we see sort of the Biden administration will be subpoenaed for all these documents on who knows how many issues, but I think the Trump administration was much more flagrant in terms of its violation of just not responding or refusing to acknowledge any congressional subpoenas. Will the Biden administration do that, or will they do what traditionally administrations have done, which is comply with Congress and in terms of their subpoena power? So we'll have to see how this all unfolds. But my guess is that Biden wouldn't want to sort of, be accused of being like Trump in that way.
And the one thing I want to add to that, I mean, obviously, Hunter Biden and these type of investigations, is he going to come to a congressional hearing to testify? I mean, I highly doubt it. But my guess is Republicans are going to try to, I mean, they've already said it, right? They're going to try to investigate the investigators. And so the January 6th hearing, they're going to try to say how it was politicized and used against Republicans. And I imagine it will be a long commercial that they can use for the 2024 election, for president, and also for these congressional races. I mean, the Democrats, I mean, people don't like to say it in this way, but the January 6th hearing, even though it was very, obviously the investigation needed to happen. We need to find out what happened, but it focused mostly on one aspect, and that was Trump and him actually inciting kind of like the people that go and attack and storm the Capitol. But very little was devoted to like real security failures by the Sergeant of Arms in both chambers in terms of preparing and not letting something like this happen. So yes, someone can incite it, hopefully not sitting president, but we should have enough security forces to make sure that you don't overrun one of the most secure, supposedly one of the most secure areas in the country. And it happened. And so we didn't really see a lot of accountability there in terms of hearings. Now I hear that Democrats said they were going to do more. There's been a GAO, government accountability study, that looks at some of these failures, but I mean, I don't imagine that Republicans will try to get at the truth. They will try to use it to paint a picture of the Democrats behaving badly in order to help boost their electoral chances in 2024. So I'm still waiting for that hearing, though. I'd like to get all of the details of why that happened and why we couldn't control it.
Yeah, and I think the same thing will happen with sort of the origins of COVID and that committee, which is going to be aimed at really going after Fauci, and sort of because that's sort of Fauci is this sort of persona non grata with a lot of Republicans, right? And so it's less about how do we prevent a future pandemic or how do we invest in terms of health in order to prevent a future pandemic, but rather to try to sort of embarrass Fauci in some way.
So I think we could keep the conversation going for quite a while longer, but we are unfortunately at the end of our time. I would like to give all of our panelists a chance to provide any last thoughts that they've got rattling around before we go ahead and close.
I'll just say that I think, we've talked about some of the interesting things to watch in this Congress, but I just think generally, it will be very interesting to see if some of these concessions that McCarthy made to the holdouts in his quest to become speaker really do have consequences for changing how the House operates. They have the potential to. I am somewhat skeptical that he will sort of stick to all of the commitments when the going gets tough. But it really would be a different place if we saw frequent, more open floor debate and more sort of consideration of single subject bills on the floor of the House and all kinds of things. And so, again, I'm skeptical we'll get there, but if he does actually follow through, it will be interesting to watch.
Thanks. I will just say I think we have multiple like former staffers or fellows on this panel, and I just want to go back to this idea that I think looking at staffers is super important and what staffers are doing. And I think we talked a little bit about diversity in Congress, and I think that one consequence of this diversity among them in the member level is also more diversity at the staff level. And also we have sort of, newer like progressive members of color, for instance, who I think are giving their staff also a lot more independence than we typically have seen previously, in terms of staffers sort of just being like a messaging vehicle for their members, or just sort of aligning with their members' point of view. I think we're seeing a lot more independence at the staff level, where they're feeling more comfortable speaking out. Again, not great, still sort of hard to get staffers, I think, to chat with me about certain things. But in general, right, we're seeing staffers sort of not being afraid to speak out about like working conditions and those types of things, and actually organize with each other. And it seems like we're in this sort of new era of staff organizing and staff independence. And so I would just ask people to sort of pay attention to that, because I think we might see some interesting mobilization efforts among staff in the coming years.
So the quick immediate thing that I'm looking at that's not necessarily any research wise or anything like that is just Kirsten Sinema and how that's going to play out, right? So I think she's still caucusing with the Democrats. She's an independent, but she's caucusing. She's already have a prominent primary challenger. Well, it's not going to be a primary challenger because she's no longer, and I think that's the reason why she is an independent, because Gallego is going to challenge and probably win. And so that's going to be an important seat for the Democrats, right? Like, will they somehow clash, and can a Republican sneak in and win that seat? Because now for independents, how does that shape her politics in the Senate, in terms of, trying to cut deals, and would she side with Republicans on certain, to stop certain Democratic measures? I mean, I don't know. It's divided government, so it probably doesn't matter, but we're talking about a lot of this symbolic gesturing that's going to be going on. So I'm watching that. The other thing that I think in terms of academic, and I said this earlier, and we really need to look, I think, get more serious within the discipline and looking at what type of candidates are being elected, right? Is there any type of electoral reforms, any type of changes? I mean, Jason and I, the independent redistricting commissions, we've advocated for that, and we've done research on that. Ranked choice voting, does it really make the candidates more moderate? Evidence says that it does. You're going to get more moderate candidates. Would we start seeing a different type of Congress in terms of how they relate, the type of bills? Would they cooperate more? Would we see more bipartisan support, or are those days just done? I mean, so I think those are the type of things that we really need to grapple with as political scientists, in terms of providing the type of information that that policymakers need and that citizens need in order to make informed decisions. Because we all say that we care about making sure we have functional political institutions, and I think this is one way to do it.
Well, I guess we'll close by saying thank you to everyone for joining us to hear this fantastic conversation. And thank you especially to our panel of experts for providing all of these insights. It was really great to chat with you all, really great to see you. So thank you for taking the time.